Without further ado, I'd like to introduce this evening's panel, starting off with the director of tonight's film, Ms. Abigail Disney. I'd like to introduce to the stage the Reverend Robert Schenck. And last but certainly not least, Miss Lucy McBath. So first of all, I just want to thank everyone for coming here. And again, congratulations on a truly wonderful and important film.
Thank you.
Now, we will be opening the floor to questions, but I have a few first, and I promise not to go more than 2 or 3 hours. But probably the most pressing questions, let's get this out of the way first.
Yeah.
Disney is the Disney. It was your great uncle who was Walt, correct?
That's exactly right. We got it out of the way. Good.
We got it out of the way. Good.
It's not the elephant in the room, it's Dumbo. But
Well, you know, on paper, you and Reverend Schenck are somewhat an odd couple. You know, when I first heard about it, you are self-identified as a pro-choice liberal feminist, and Reverend Schenck is not. So,
yes.
So actually, when I first heard about it, it almost sounded like the setup to a joke. You know, a feminist and an evangelical walk into a bar. And,
Yeah.
So how did the idea of this film start? Were you looking for a conservative voice, or did that come organically out of the process?
Mm-hmm. Well, this film has been it was like 20 films on the way to being the film that it is, which often happens with documentaries. But at the heart of it, yeah, I grew up in a very conservative family. And so I think I understand conservative values, and I don't reject them. I live the life I live because I accept the values I was taught. I just have a different idea of what they ask of me. So, you know, I would look at what, you know, the NRA, the bottom line of what's happened in the last 50 years as the result of the NRA's prodding, and these are not conservative values. These are radically socially destabilizing values. As I understand conservatism, socially destabilizing values are not at the heart. So I knew there had to be people in good faith on the other side, people who believed what they believed genuinely in all sincerity. And if they meant what they said about the value of every single human life, then they either weren't thinking about it or were very, very troubled. There had to be. So I went looking for somebody who would talk to me in good faith, and Rob was prepared to do that.
Well, prepared to a certain extent, in the sense that you, prior to being approached by Abigail, were already discerning how your conscience was compelling you to speak out on this topic. But when you were initially approached, you didn't say yes off the bat. In fact, I read somewhere that you would call him every Monday for 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Long time.
And you know, you would always say, well, I'm still praying about it, but you didn't commit right away. What did she finally say that on that 6th week that got you to finally commit?
Boy, I haven't taken myself through that memory exercise of what it actually was. I know that in my conscience, I was continuously troubled, more and more. And in my mind was my own spiritual mentor, my posthumous spiritual director, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You saw a quote, which was a surprise to me when I saw the film for the first time. It was Abby's kind gift to me. If you're not familiar with Bonhoeffer, he was a very courageous young theologian in Germany during the rise of National Socialism. At age 39, hanged by the Nazis for resisting Hitler and the Nazi regime. And Bonhoeffer had said so many things in the 12,000 pages he left us of magnificent theology and ethics. But one of the things that kind of stuck in my my conscience was that the church must speak early and not late. And so that was percolating, and Abby had created some very safe space for me. And I have to say, you know, in our first dinner meeting, when we talked over a dinner table, Abby had created an atmosphere where I could be very honest, and she was very inviting. And it is an unlikely pairing. I mean, we've joked, but only a few years ago, probably the only place we would have met was literally across a police tape at a demonstration. And we would have been on opposite sides. So the fact that she was generous enough to let me be who I am without challenging me in that way, at least in this, in this restricted zone, was very inviting. And I'd like to, I suppose confession is good for the soul, so I would love to tell you that I spent all that time praying. I didn't. I spent a lot of it worrying and, seeking the advice of colleagues and friends, some of whom warned me against taking any public stand. But finally, I did talk with one very prominent conservative leader, somebody who I think would surprise a lot of people, who said, if this is where your conscience is taking you, then you must speak, or you'll never be able to sleep. And it was shortly after that, either you called me or I called you, and I said, it's time to go. Not that I didn't think I had a safety cord along the way. I was ready to pull until Lucy showed up. Wow. And in that garden, and what you see is literally our prayer garden at our ministry house on Capitol Hill. And if you know the story of the Gospels, you know Jesus made a very important decision in a garden, and that was not lost on me. And Lucy's appeal from the depth of her soul brought me across the finish line.
Wow. You mentioned that word conscience. It's right back in the news given Pope Francis's recent exhortation, where he's really trying to bring the role of conscience, a formed conscience, back into center stage. And mentioning Dietrich Bonhoeffer, watching this film, I thought of Bonhoeffer's whole idea of cheap grace, the idea of faith without cost. Yes. Lucy, first of all, as a parent myself, I just want to say how much I admire you for your courage and your strength and your faith, and how honored we are to have you here tonight. So just thank you for being here. And I guess watching this film through the eyes of a parent, I can't say that I could ever imagine what you went through, but what I did wonder is, what enabled you to live through that emotional pain, and not just live through it again, but so publicly in front of a camera? And what did Abigail say to you that sort of made you say, this is something that I want to be part of?
Well, most definitely, when we were introduced to Abby through our civil attorney, John, who was in the film. And I had been talking to John about the fact that, I was just very, very disturbed that morally no one in the country seemed to think that this was an issue or a problem when people are dying in the street needlessly. And so I'm not sure how it came about, how John and Abby came together. But John did say, well, Abigail Disney. And at first when he said Abigail Disney, I was like, sure, right. Yeah, right, yeah, sure. Not the Abigail Disney. He's like, no, Abigail Disney, I'd like to bring you to New York, and, you can meet. And she has been looking for a vehicle or a way to talk about consciously what's been happening in the country with, the influence that the anti-gun lobby has on the nation and our legislators and civic leaders. And so, let's go talk to her. And so that's how I had the very first meeting with Abby in her office in New York City. And then it just kind of took off from there. And I think simply because Abby is a peace activist, and a lot of the work that she does is with women around the world that are changing cultures. I think that's how I just kind of ended up working with her, and because of my faith, because I had understood, from my understanding, that all the gun violence prevention work that had been done prior to in the country, faith was never an element of it. I wasn't hearing pastors around the country talking about the tragedy morally of what was happening, and that disturbed me, because I understood from the very beginning that if we're going to call ourselves Christians and we let this happen and no one speaks up and cries out about it, specifically the shepherds in the pulpit, then something is really, really morally and ethically wrong in the country. And that was the way I was choosing to address and focus my energy in gun violence prevention.
You know, Lucy speaks about the role of pastors, and you know, one of the most one moving, I should say, among many moving moments in the film is your recollection of your conversation with the father of the other gun victim, who questioned where the clergy was, where their voices were. What would you say is the role of the clergy in speaking not only on this, but on many pressing moral issues of our day? And then a sort of a follow-up question is, now that the film has been out, what is the reaction of your fellow pastors?
Well, on the latter, it's mixed. But I've discovered some surprising allies. And but I'll go to the first part of your question. In terms of the role of the clergy, I see it as both pastoral, helping to guide people through all of the propaganda, the fear factor that I bring up in my conversation in the film, which I think is very real. And that's one thing I appreciate too. From the start of this project, we've wanted to affirm everyone's real experience, including their fears. And there's real palpable fear. It's not all ostensibly fear. There is some genuine fear. And what a lot of my people are being told is that you have a limited number of options. And probably your best option is just arm yourself and get ready to shoot. I think that's a woefully deficient response. And I think pastors can help people work through those fears on a spiritual level as counselors. But beyond that, I think there's a prophetic role. And part of the prophetic role of the pastor is to confront fallacies and deal with them sensitively, but still very strongly. So the pulpit and preaching is extremely important. Preaching, teaching, and pastoral counsel on this question. And most pastors have told me, I just don't touch it. First of all, it divides the congregation. It agitates and upsets people. It will expose us to criticism. We'll be labeled as, as one side or the other, but certainly, anyone that would question the orthodoxy, and there is an orthodoxy on this. So, most will say, I just don't treat it. But many have come to me literally whispering and saying, I'm with you. I'm with you on this. I just don't know how to treat it. So we've been developing tools. And in fact, we've just come out with a toolkit for pastors to deal with this kind of a very volatile, difficult subject in the pulpit. But I think there is a way for them to do that. Some are. I have been. And there is a mixed response, but a surprising number of people, especially women, who have come and said, I don't like it. It makes me very nervous. I don't think it comports with our Christian witness. And that's pastors that need to take that first position. It
reminds me of that space for honest argument. A hero of mine, G.K. Chesterton, was fond of saying, you should never let a quarrel get in the way of an honest argument. And it seems hopefully we can have more honest and civil arguments. But I think your line was so powerful when you challenged your audience that in championing the Second Amendment, you have to be careful that you don't violate the Second Commandment. And how has that resonated within your faith community?
It has given people pause because, of course, as evangelicals, we talk about being people of the book, that we're biblically grounded and centered. Evangelicals are people of the Bible. So our often a formal statement of faith will say that the Bible is the final rule of faith and practice. So when I introduce the question, are we looking to a secular political instrument as the final answer to this moral and spiritual question, I do get people who pause for a moment and wonder if that is the right track. John Wesley, who arguably was the founder of what we know as modern evangelicalism as we have it in this country, said, we are Bible Christians. So in many ways, I see this as calling our people back to a biblically centered faith. And I see the opposite as a crisis of faith, that it's actually a defection from one of our cardinal tenets of faith. So for me, the answer is, to put it in Christian colloquial language, we need revival. And that's what I'm hoping our folks will preach.
Abigail, you said you, from the start, wanted to frame this film as a moral conversation, not a political one.
Yeah.
And you said, I read somewhere, it was a great line, where you said you wanted it just as an opportunity to step back from the yelling. Obviously in the national discourse, there's few topics that are more polarizing than guns. What would you hope a film like this adds to the political discourse? And what is your experience of the reactions been, particularly among those people of goodwill that Reverend Schenck mentioned, who hold a different view, sincere in that view, and could possibly see this film as sort of pushing a partisan agenda?
Right. And there's been plenty of that. But, I started this all after Sandy Hook because I watched people on my Facebook page. They would take the same set of facts and run in the opposite direction with them. And I just thought, this is a broken political dynamic. This is really a broken political dynamic. No matter which side of the debate you're on, it should trouble you that half of the people went this way and half of the people went this way. So it seemed to me that you couldn't add to the political discourse. What you had to do was trump it. You had to end run around it. You had to find a different way of approaching. You had to talk about it on a different plane. And so this was an attempt to, I do think that, we had guns in the Old West and all the rest of it. The guns got grandfathered in to our culture. In Great Britain, you didn't have guns. The lord of the land you lived on was in charge of them. People just didn't have them. So they didn't have to confront the pre-existence of guns in socially widespread. We never had our moral conversation. We never did our moral homework. They were just there. And I think to a large extent, we've gone backwards and found justifications for what's there rather than had an honest conversation about what should be there. And then figured out what to do with the guns. So, and I really do believe that facts never change anybody's mind. I know that if I really think something, I don't want to hear your facts. So what will change my mind is personal experience, stories, and yes, talking about it on a much higher plane, about what should be done, what should the world look like. So that it was an attempt to bring a higher analysis to an old problem.
Lucy, at one point, I believe it was Reverend Schenck who says in the film that he doesn't like always dealing in the theoretical. It has to come down to reality at some point. Well, the subject of this film is there's no theory for you. This is based in a very tragic reality. At the end of the film, you say very beautifully that it doesn't really matter if you ever even see the results of the work that you're doing, because you know the rightness of the work you're doing. But then you also say that you've out of this tragedy, you found, a sense of God's higher purpose. If you could leave every audience member here with one thought, what would that takeaway be?
You have to find the essence of who you are and why you were created. And in doing that comes a lot of soul searching. And that comes a lot of really understanding who God is in you. And once you've been able to find that, then that helps you find and sustain your purpose.
Yeah. Speaking of purpose, we talked upstairs earlier about your passion for filmmaking. And I had rewatched one of your earlier films, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, about women of faith in war-torn Liberia. And in that film, there's a chord that's very similar to this film, and I think it comes down to one word. It's empathy. The great late film critic Roger Ebert called movies the greatest empathy machines in the world, because they allow us, even for 2 hours, to look through someone else's eyes and walk in someone else's shoes. As a documentarian, what are your thoughts about the role of empathy in the filmmaking process?
Right. Well, films, first of all, I did grow up in a filmmaking family, and I saw what happens when the lights go down and you're in a dark place and something really just takes over your heart. It's magic. It really is. I mean, I know that's an overworked word in my family, but it is true that it is magic. And I can remember going to films where like I had a sore leg, and then my sore leg just disappeared because I was in that film and in that reality. And that is powerful. That is really powerful. And it makes me sad and frustrated and angry that for the most part, the people who have the power to do that use it so badly. Use it to disregard the value of human life, to fill our hearts with anger and violence and blood and gore and disrespectful sexuality and all the rest of it. It's everybody can't do this. You have to have the ability to do this, and so all these highly talented people are frittering away this gift that they have on films and entertainment that push us backwards and deeper into the darkness. So what I want to be as a filmmaker is to be somebody who opens people out, wakes them up, and asks them to be better. We were talking about the role of pastoral, of pastors, and of course Francis is the great pastor, and he's a game-changing pastor, and we've had a lot of popes who have wagged their fingers, and he doesn't do that. What he does is he asks you to aspire, and you've seen the way Americans have responded to that, and that's what I want our films to do, is to be invitations to aspire and to be the best possible person you can be.
Well, a centerpiece of Francis' whole theology is the whole idea of encountering people and encountering them where they are. And this film is a beautiful example of three people with different backgrounds encountering each other where you are. Reverend Schenck, from a pastoral point of view, what role does empathy play?
Huge, particularly in evangelicalism, because evangelicalism has been described as a religion of the heart. And we often say that a person with an experience is not at the mercy of a person with facts. So we are, I think one of the reasons this film is a powerful tool and Lucy's story is so powerful in my circles. And I have had people arguing right up to the point where they encounter Lucy and her story. And now they can't, it's not an argument about statistics and tables and analysis. It now becomes a person's story. And that's very important because, again, for, use idiosyncratic terms for born-again folks, we have an experience at the altar. It's not a mental assent. Very often there's weeping. Lucy's from a very passionate Pentecostal background. You know, altar calls in the churches, you know, yeah, I mean, there's whooping and hollering and shouting and laughing and weeping and crying. And emotions are very, very important. And I would argue God. Jesus certainly showed emotion. He wept. God is described in emotional terms. So emotion is very, very powerful. Empathy is very, very powerful. And I think we've been able to make some distance because this is about a deep personal experience. And we're treating it, as Abby said, as a moral and theological crisis, which has to do with the heart and the conscience and the mind and our inner thoughts. So I've seen people weeping watching this film. I don't think that's playing with people's emotions. I think it's touching a very real part of our being that is often ignored in discussions about matters like this. So I think Abby pitched it just right for our folks, and I'm watching it being received that way. So very, very important. In fact, we talk about in evangelical circles, you haven't really done well with the sermon until you ring the bell, and that means touch people's hearts.
Well, you know, Lucy, your story has definitely touched our hearts, and I think what's so beautiful is how you came through that darkness, and you came out with such a light about you. Have you had an opportunity to ever speak to Jordan's killer? Have you had an opportunity to talk to him? And because you seem, you know, there's a sense of forgiveness about you in the way you've just everything about you. And I guess also the second part of the question is, in the activist work that you do now, I see such a bond has developed between you and Reverend Schenck. Do you still work closely together?
It's very interesting because, you know, we're doing the same work, but kind of in different realms. You know, Reverend Schenck works a lot with the theologians and the pastors, and I work a great deal with our legislators and civic leaders in academia. I work on the gun violence prevention side, but definitely it's all sheltered by faith. Mm-hmm. And in terms of talking with Michael Dunn, I've not had a chance to speak with him. He's not expressed any forgiveness or remorse that I'm aware of, but I did forgive him very early on. In fact, I was right here in New York City very shortly after Jordan was murdered, and we were doing the initial rounds of national media, and I felt very, very compelled to go into a church, and there I wrestled with God. I was weeping and weeping and weeping and just wrestling with God, saying, please don't make me forgive him. I can't do this. I'll do anything you want me to do, but this I can't do. And I remember just wrestling and weeping, and by the time I left the church, I knew if I were going to really live as the Christian I really desire to be, then I was going to have to forgive Michael Dunn. And when I walked out of the church, I knew that I could do it. I knew that it was done. And when I walked out of the church, there was such a tremendous weight just taken off my shoulders. And I just felt, okay, Lord, this is the beginning. And I didn't know what it was the beginning of. But I felt a tremendous sense of relief and forgiveness. I felt really sorry for Michael Dunn because he doesn't know the God that I serve. But I was very excited and very happy because that weight had been lifted off of my shoulders. I knew that Michael Dunn had already taken so much from me, and I was not going to allow him to take anything else from me. But I walked out of that church knowing that there was something I was supposed to do. Didn't know what it was, but I knew that because I had released it and given it to God, that I'd done everything I was supposed to do. And that whether or not Michael Dunn ever said to me, forgive me, that's not my concern. I continue to pray for him. My family prays for him because I don't really want him to suffer eternally, which I know that he will, should he not give his life to Christ. But I know that I had done everything that I needed to do, and that released me and gave me the freedom to walk out of that church. And I truly believe that is the reason why I sit before you here today, because God could not trust me to do this work without complete and total forgiveness.
Well, thank you for that. That theme of forgiveness is woven throughout this whole film, and you even reference it. One of the critical turning points in your discernment process was your experience with the Amish children and the Amish community. In fact, one of the earliest productions we did here at the Sheen Center was the Amish Project, which is a one-woman show about that tragedy. Yes. A common denominator also between them is the whole idea of being people of strong faith, and that seems to be a common denominator in many of your films. This film, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which if you haven't seen it, you should definitely see. It's a wonderful film.
PrayTheDevilBackToHell.com.
What draws you to people of faith as subjects for your film?
That is a hard question to answer. I grew up very strict Irish Catholic family. I ran like hell from that.
You can tell this is a Catholic institution because they're all sitting in
Everybody's
the back row pews there. Yeah.
We were saying everybody's in the back. I love that. Yeah, I was always way in the back. You know, with the accompanying resentments that a lot of people run with, but I never didn't love and respect the people of faith that seemed genuine to me, and feel gratitude to them, because even as I ran, they still shaped my heart, and they shaped my reflexes and my understanding of my marching orders as a human being. And I feel sort of lucky that I do have a habit of just accepting people as they are. I don't think it's my place to judge someone else's faith or someone else's understanding of the world. And so when the women said to us, you know, we got together as Muslims and Christians, we forgave each other our differences, we learned each other's prayers, we went to each other's rituals, and I just had so much faith, so much respect for that. And you know, my version of faith is that I know, this film is very open-ended, right? We haven't decided for you what you're supposed to think about things. And we very deliberately left this film in your hands, in your heart, that you can decide. And that's because I believe in the deepest possible way that if you really do bring all of your moral, best of your moral self to this thinking, I know where you're going to land. I know that. And so that's my version of faith, is that I know that whether it's by a strict faith in the written word or by something more abstract, I think if you let yourself listen to the best part of yourself, you will land in a place that is good and right.
And I think what's so wonderful about the film is you're not trying to necessarily persuade anyone. I think Fulton Sheen, after who this center is named after, famously said, if all you're concerned about is winning an argument, you'll never win a convert. And I think that's really what fuels this film. I want to be sensitive to time and give people a chance to ask a question, but I want to just pose one last question to all of you. The filmmaker Spike Jonze said that documentaries are journeys of discovery. So what did each of you discover on the journey of this filmmaking process? Perhaps we'll start with the director.
Well, yeah, documentaries are journeys of discovery because if what you're making is a documentary like this one where you meet Rob, you meet Lucy, and then you agree to sort of go forward, you have no idea where it's headed, whether there's going to be a story at all, whether it's going to be interesting, whether anything will happen. It's terrifying. It's terrifying, and in many ways, it's much harder than making a scripted film. I discovered that maybe one of the most satisfying sensations you can have in life is to have a stereotype blow up in your face. It's fabulous. It is a really high, good feeling. I like to have my convictions troubled. I like to be not certain. And I like to discover what people have to offer to surprise me. And it's been nothing but surprise after surprise.
Reverend?
I'm going to play right off of that and say that I discovered that a non-religious, secular, progressive, liberal, social activist could be a gift from God to me in the most profound way.
I would have to say that I've just have, in a way, I never imagined the depth of God's grace and mercy. Even in my deepest tragedy, how much He loves me.
Well, Francis has deemed this the year of mercy, so what a wonderful sentiment to leave us with. We now turn over to the audience. If we have any questions, we have 2 ushers with microphones, so if you could just raise your hand and they'll be happy to.
I'm sort of sad that it's already April and I didn't know till now that it was the year of mercy. I've wasted 4 months.
Well, you have a few more months to get another film made if you'd like.
One of the examples in the film of why we need to be armed is the example of someone coming into a church and shooting up everyone in the church. And obviously we had that, somewhat recently in Charleston. I was wondering if any of you have spoken to any of the people from that church or heard them speak about the question of whether or not they wish someone in that prayer group had been armed and been able to take out the shooter, or if they would rather that they die or the relatives die instead of taking a life and acting in violence. Have any of you heard them speak to that?
Right after the shooting, Rob and I went to Charleston. We traveled to Charleston, and we prayed for the community. We prayed for the church. We prayed openly with the community there. Since then, I have had the tremendous honor and privilege of making friends with some of the Emmanuel victims. Reverend Sharon Risher, her mother was murdered along with 3 cousins. And then also another friend of mine, Watrina Middleton, who's a social justice activist. And each and every one of them both of them has said, never in a million years would they ever have said or thought that anything other than love and acceptance and forgiveness is what they would ask for. So they truly, that community, that church, they truly have forgiven the young man for what he did. And I think there was such a tremendous revival. Rob and I talked about that, after that, such a horrible, horrible tragedy. There was such a tremendous spiritual revival. And I remember saying, wow, if it could be like this all the time. It was amazing how much love and forgiveness there was, simply because the Emmanuel members said, we will forgive. And so, but 2 of the individuals I'm very, very close to, talk to very frequently, work with them, and they have said nothing other than we did the right thing, and open and heartfelt forgiveness is what we had to offer.
And I'll just say about that, if you want to look for moral leadership from a church in this country. It comes from the African American church, because that view that somebody's getting ready to walk into your church and shoot everybody up is statistically totally unsupported in the white evangelical church. You know, these numbers are microscopic, and 80% or something like that of church shootings in white evangelical churches are domestic disputes that have spilled over into the church. But what you're hearing, this fear you're hearing is, you know, these are evangelicals who think that, you know, ISIS is coming or somebody's going to come to kill them as evangelicals. And the way I think of it is, I think white people in this country haven't lived in fear. They don't know how to do that. And they're like beginners. And African American people, they know how to live in fear. They have lived in fear all of their lives. So they know how to handle fear. And it's not with violence. Because by the time Dylan Roof walks into your church, everybody's already failed. That's a failure of the community, that's a failure of the family, that's a failure of everybody that he walked into that church at all. And if your response, your only thought of a response to a very unfortunate, deeply troubled young man who has been failed is to shoot him dead, then you have lost all moral bearings.
Could you explain a little bit more about, well, it just amazes me that the film came to be, in the fact that you have the two major characters with these extraordinary arcs that seem, you know, they just came together perfectly, and that would no way to know how that would have happened. And so, I don't know, I'm just sort of amazed. I don't know if there's any way to answer it, that question. And also maybe a little bit, you know, especially for you, Reverend Schenck, I think, and for you as well, Lucy, a little bit. I mean, the amount of trust involved in opening up. I mean, Reverend Schenck, I mean, you have a national platform. You don't know how you're going to evolve on this. You don't know how your thing is going to be used. So how did this whole thing happen? It amazes me. And can you shed any light on that?
Can I take a
Go for it.
first try at that? One is I remain a person of faith. I had a sense that a lot of this was being orchestrated from another dimension. And sometimes Abby would have to remind me of that. Sometimes Lucy would remind me of that because I would falter in my own faith. I will say on the trust factor, both Lucy and Abby made that very relatively easy because they are authentic people with big hearts. And they were taking a risk with me that I met in reciprocity. But I'm also married to a psychotherapist. And it helped in a very big way in taking risk and trusting, taking the risk that trust is. So there were a lot of elements in this, including a lot of free therapy and some paid therapy, which was a huge help. But when it came right down to it, you know, there are things that you have to take a big risk for. And while, you know, I approached it with some fear and trepidation, I knew I would pay a price for it, and I have. But there are certainly things worth paying a price for, and this was certainly one of them. So regardless of the price I continue to pay, it was worth it, and I'm very happy that I took that step.
And I'll just say underneath your question, there's an itch that I probably should scratch, which is, yes, I did introduce the two of them. That wasn't just magic that they happened to come together. It's like the first commandment of documentary filmmaking is don't mess with your characters. But honestly, I just thought there's a higher purpose.
There was.
And for me, I just kind of felt it was riskier not to speak out, because then I would have to deal with my heart. and I would have to deal with the fact that I knew God was calling me to speak out, and I didn't, and I would have to live with that for the rest of my life.
And I got that message.
Now, sort of piggybacking on that question, you had said originally that you had been working independently with the two of them on their own stories.
Right.
Was it originally thought that you were going to dovetail the two, or was there other interviews that you were doing, and then you suddenly, as you were going through, you found these two most compelling, and you felt that there was your story?
Well, I mean, yeah, we were working in parallel lines, and we were also, John was very important, the attorney was very important. So we had 3 parallel lines, but, you know, off camera, there were these very interesting conversations happening. And I was hearing Lucy's heart, and I was hearing Rob's heart, and I just knew that something really important needed to happen. They needed to know each other, because the nature of their lives would be that they would never overlap unless I put them together. So once we put them together, all of a sudden the whole film started to make sense. And things started to move much more quickly, partly because he stopped being such a chicken.
Now he's on a roll.
This is a question for Reverend Schenck. At the beginning of the film, you explained that you served as counsel to Republicans and Tea Party leaders. I'm wondering if you still have that influence, how your direction might have changed, and if you've counseled Democrats whose views on gun violence prevention are closer to action.
Yes. The welcome mat is not put out quite as enthusiastically as it had been with my Republican friends. You know, I think I do put a very high value on long-term and deep friendships. So I've invested in those friendships over, in some cases, decades. So there's a lot of equity to draw on and a lot of trust. It's been a mixed reaction. Some have been, you know, well, I can see why you feel, you know, the way that you do. Let's just not talk about it publicly. Or let's not do any photo ops right now. Others have said, you know, let's explore some possible platforms, you know, to introduce this. And I've tried to be, you know, very candid, and I've gone to see some of them. And, you know, a couple have said, have you lost your mind? Are you trying to commit, you know, professional suicide? Or, you know, we've got momentum. This is only going to give the opposition, unfortunate metaphor, ammunition to fire at us. And so the explanation that I've offered to them is that, again, as Abby was saying earlier, this is not a conservative value, and particularly when it comes to pro-life ethics. In fact, it's in complete contradiction to it. And I've tried to make that appeal, and it's been received to some degree. So again, it's been mixed for the most part. It's been a rather cool reception, if there's been one at all. But I do think I'm appealing to the secret thoughts of a lot of hearts. So I want to help them find some courage as well. And have I gone to Democrats? Yes. In fact, this whole topic has allowed me to develop some good friends on the Democrat side. And again, I have to be a little careful there because I don't want to alienate the other side too quickly. I want to have that more fulsome conversation. But it's been a wonderful way to reach across some very deep divides and find some people who surprise me with where they come out on the question. And this has crossed over into some other areas, and one of them being the death penalty. I've had a number of pastors and political personalities shock me in saying, well, you know, you're talking about guns right now. For me, it's the death penalty, and they've surprised me with a shift in their position on the death penalty. So there may be some spiritual and moral awakening that's happening, and I want to be patient. I'd like to think that this is my next 30-year project.
I will say one reason that the film isn't more broadly known in our world here in New York is because we've tried to keep our powder dry, another metaphor about guns, for conservatives. Because, we just keep making documentaries for each other, and yes, I know that the environment is warming, and I know all that stuff. Why are we bothering to just talk to each other? I really wanted to make a film that we could really get some mileage on the other side with.
You use in the film several times the phrase, it's of the same piece. And that really reminded me, it was very resonant of Cardinal Bernardine's whole idea of a seamless garment.
Yes.
So it was a very powerful statement that you made. Do we have any other questions?
Hello, can you hear me?
On the side.
I think this is for you, Reverend, but Lucy and Abigail, you can answer as well. Do you think the biggest hurdle is gun control and allegiance to the Second Amendment, or is it survival and self-defense? As Tertullian said in the 3rd century, when Jesus ungirt Peter, he ungirt every Christian. And is that the hurdle that they have to get over of saying, my enemy's worth loving even at the point of my own death? Or is it really about guns and allegiance to the Second Amendment?
It's certainly a mix on all of those things. I have decided, because of who I am, I'm not an authority on the politics or the legislative solutions to this. I don't even think that would be my best contribution. So I treat it as a moral, ethical, and biblical question. So in bringing it to that, I do think that's at least where the solution lies for my community, for evangelicals. That when we introduce a discussion on the politics, on the legislative proposals, there's an immediate alienation. But one of the reasons that Lucy's companionship with me is so important is because she speaks the language of faith. She lives her faith. She is one of us. When I introduce Lucy in my world, instantly she's identified as a sister in Christ. She loves the Lord. And that's important. So I've kept it to a spiritual, moral, ethical, and theological treatment. And I do think that's a way to separate from all of the clutter and mixed emotion of the political debate. And I do think once we resolve that in our hearts and souls, then we can bring that to our engagement in the political arena, and we'll do it more effectively. And I think in a more durable way. So I'm not sure if it answers your question, but that's where I'm focusing all of my attention.
Well, and I would just add, nobody wants to admit this about ourselves, but we're not a peaceful country. We're not a peaceful society. If you think of popular culture as like the dream state of a country, and you look at our popular culture, we are in love with death. We are in love with aggression and fighting and war and violence. We are in love with it. And we are raising our children to love it. And we've rewritten our history to make it sound better and more violent than it really was. And we've written, so even evangelicals have sort of slouched into the prevailing culture. And when I made Pray the Devil Back to Hell, one of the things that happened was I was asked to go to so many places to talk about peace and peace building and whether women make a difference or not. And it really hit me so hard in Monterrey, Mexico. I was just giving my usual patter, and all of a sudden it just felt like this massive lump in my chest. I thought, who do I think I am as an American woman, knowing there are 250,000 weapons crossing from Texas and Arizona into Mexico every year? to fuel this conflict and this violence here. And I have never lifted a finger to change my own culture. So I started understanding that as an American, I had to stay home and be a peace builder in my own country, because we have to change this cultural prejudice in the direction of violence. Everyone in the world is counting on us to get better at that, because everyone in the world suffers from our belligerence.
And I kind of liken my role to being, I always say that I'm the accidental activist. I've never done this work before. Just strictly going by God's direction and instinct. But I liken my work to being, as the victim of gun violence, the conscience, the moral conscience, and showing our legislators and the power that be that the people that are dying in the streets are not statistics and numbers. We're real people. And that, you know, I too never thought that we would be victims of gun violence. But I remember God speaking into me 6 to 8 weeks after Jordan died, and literally I was just somewhere else. I honestly believe, you know, I was in this realm. Here's the heavenlies and the earth realm, and I was somewhere in between, and just listening to God. And he was showing me stories in the Bible that I hadn't read, just all of this. And he said, my people must see my face. You must show them who I am. They must turn their faces back to me. I will take you places you've never been. I will open doors, and you will usher others through. So I liken my role to be, my role is to do that, and to be that, to be the face of the victim, but also the face of God, and remind our legislators who they are accountable to, not the NRA gun lobby, but the constituents and the communities that they serve. And I challenge them, can you honestly look me in the face as the mother of a young man who died needlessly and tell me you are not concerned about what's happening within your community? And I challenge you to tell me that you do not care about what's happening in your community. And I challenge you to tell me that you are not willing to embrace some kind of cultural change that you can be a part of. Are you willing to tell me that you're going to turn a blind eye to what's happening in this country and turn your back on the people that put you in office?
In the language of, you know, John Paul II, it's how do we turn it from a culture of death into a culture of life? Do we have any other questions?
Yes.
One right there.
I want to thank all of you for inspiring us. And now that you have, I have a two-part, a very short question. What would you like the audience to do now that we're inspired? And secondly, what would be your advice so that when we go back and we're around the kitchen table or in the neighborhood, that we don't get the sweet potato across our face, that we'll repeat the scene that you've lived? So the question goes to all of you. Thank you again.
I didn't really hear the second half very well.
Okay.
What can we do around the kitchen table?
Oh, depends on your kitchen table. My kitchen table was rough, and I would have had my work cut out for me. But yeah, let's think of it as the Thanksgiving table, right? And there's always an uncle or an aunt or whatever, and you can't greet that uncle or aunt with the facts and the information. You can't greet them with an idea for a law that needs passing. You can't greet them in aggression and hostility. You have to take them where they are and just genuinely have a conversation. I think that's the only way. And one of the reasons that Rob and I were able to build as much trust as we built was because one of the first things I said to him was, like, we could fight right away. If we want to fight, we can just fight right away. Or we can choose to take this big difference we have and just put it over to the side and see, you know, if we have common ground. And let's just choose to share our spaces that we share. And in relationship, then we can talk about the hard stuff. So, I mean, I think that all of us with the difficult, boy, do I have difficult uncles and aunts. we have to dial it back and reset the relationship and start over again from relationship. I think that's, and by the way, there's the first half of the question, as a producer, please, your social networks and the people that you know, we need broadcast numbers, so you need to go and watch it and tell everybody you know to watch it on May 10th on PBS and let them know that it's going to be on Netflix not long after that. You know, selfishly as a producer, you know, I would like people to see this.
I think one of the most effective things you can do in a very difficult subject like this is invite people to be very honest and bite your tongue and listen and affirm their humanity. So I would reiterate that, you know, ask them to watch the PBS special. They can rent it at iTunes,
Yeah,
Amazon, where else?
I got him,
A couple of other places. Is it Zulu?
Amazon, Google Play,
Google
iTunes,
Play.
and
Hulu?
not Hulu.
Hulu. No,
What is
not
it?
Hulu.
Kudzu?
I don't know the other one. I know iTunes and
What is it?
Amazon,
Hey, Jamie's out there somewhere.
but you know,
Voodoo.
and then they're gonna, you know, but you don't want them to resent you for having them, you know, spend 99 cents on something they didn't want to see. So tell them PBS is free. So watch it on PBS, and then would you let me know what you think of it? And really listen to their response. You know, exercise the generosity and the discipline of listening to them regardless of what their opinion is, and engage them in that kind of conversation. I would hope that if you're a person of faith, if you have a faith community, particularly a church, you might go to your pastor and say, you know, is it time that we address this in the pulpit, or at least in our small group Bible study or discussion group or Sunday school, because, you know, this is a growing problem and it has a Christian solution. If we are, you know, people of confident faith, then there is an answer there, and we should explore it together. We should pray about it together, discuss it together, and find a solution together. And I think, I'm going to show my bias here, but I think that communities of faith are some of the most dynamic in our civilization, and that we ought to be bringing an answer. I was asked early on by a member of Congress. He said, you know, Reverend, your people, meaning evangelicals, have an opinion on everything, except guns.
Yep.
Why don't you talk to us about guns? And that was a question that haunted me right up to meeting Abby. We didn't have an answer for that, and we need an answer, and it needs to come out of our spiritual experience. So I hope you'll see it on PBS and tell a lot of other people to watch it on PBS, and then invite them over for tea or coffee and say, what did you think of it? And listen.
And I'm going to piggyback on what Rob just said, is that, you know, I talk to legislators all the time around the country, and I tell them all the statistics and all of that information. But one thing I have noticed as I'm, you know, canvassing their offices is that there's no one of faith. There are no faith activists there that are pleading with the legislators to really take a hard look at the gun laws and the laws that they're passing. And so I would say, as people of faith, challenge yourselves to come together, and, you know, even if you go to your legislators or you make phone calls, or, you know, you can send letters, but you have to be involved in the process, because, you know, we're all accountable to one another as people of faith. We are each other's keeper. And so to turn a blind eye, even as people of faith, and think that it's something out of your realm of experience and it's happening to those people there and it will never happen to me, then right then and there you've already lost the battle, because the scales are definitely on your eyes. because you are just as responsible for trying to make sure that everyone can live in this country without the fear of being gunned down. And so as people of faith, I would ask or challenge you to begin going to your local legislators. Find out the laws that are on your books. You know, most of the people that I talk to, they have no idea whether or not they have stand your ground. They have no idea whether or not the schools have campus carry. They have no idea what the gun laws are. All they know is they hear more and more and more carnage on the radio and on the television all the time, and that they feel so helpless and they don't know what to do. So I would say, as people, as men and women of faith, start galvanizing and mobilizing and deciding we have to challenge what's happening in the country morally. And the only way to do that is you're going to have to go to your legislators and civic leaders, and you're going to have to demand that they begin to take a hard look at the laws that are enacting that are not preserving the sanctity of human life.
Well, I will let Lucy have that final word. Thank you so much. In the film, Reverend Schenck, you said that one of the greatest temptations is the temptation of simple answers. So I thank you for your honesty this evening. I thank you for not succumbing to that temptation and for providing thoughtful and insightful answers to a very complicated question. I remind you to please watch Armor of Light May 10th on PBS. And please spread the word about this important film. And please like the Sheen Center on Facebook. Thank you so much. Have a good night.